A billionaire husband forces his 8-month pregnant wife to her knees on a cold marble floor and demands an apology in front of his mistress. He thinks the moment will disappear behind money, power, and silence. He is wrong. Because hidden in her pocket is a recording that will detonate in court 47 days later. What follows is not just betrayal, but one of the most satisfying public downfalls you will ever witness.
Her billionaire husband forced his 8-month pregnant wife to her knees on the cold marble floor of their penthouse, right in front of his mistress. He demanded she apologize. But he had no idea her phone was recording every single word. 47 days later, a courtroom heard that recording. 12 million people listened live. The judge's next order would leave the country speechless. This isn't just a tale of betrayal. It is the story of a woman who lost everything, only to rise up and ruin the man who tried to ruin her. By the time we finish, you will hear the sweetest justice ever served. You will not want to look away. I promise you, what happens inside that courtroom is unforgettable. If this story touches your heart, please subscribe and activate your notifications. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Share this with someone who needs to see it. And now our story begins. His words cut through the room like a shard of glass. Get on your knees. Charlotte Weston was paralyzed in the grand entryway of her Manhattan home. Her husband's voice was like ice. A sharp, freezing kind of ice that burns your skin and leaves a scar. She was 8 months pregnant. For weeks, her ankles had been swollen. A deep ache radiated from her lower back with every single breath. The baby had been kicking all day, agitated and restless, almost like it knew something awful was coming. The foyer itself was breathtaking. Ceilings rose 20 feet high over Italian marble floors. The chandelier alone was worth more than a family home. Charlotte had personally designed this entire penthouse, choosing every last detail. But now it all felt like a beautiful cage. Graham Holt was standing just 6 feet from her. His jaw was clenched tight. His eyes were vacant and cold. And behind him, Sienna Cross was lounging on an ivory sofa. The same sofa Charlotte had chosen 3 years earlier on their honeymoon in Paris. She was the woman Charlotte had suspected for months. There were so many signs. The late nights that turned into early mornings. The anniversary plans he always canceled. The way he kept his phone screen down all the time. The unfamiliar perfume she sometimes caught on his shirt. But suspecting is not the same as knowing. That morning, she had found the proof. There were hundreds, maybe thousands of texts, going back for years. I said, "Get on your knees." Graham's tone was sharper now, the commanding voice he used to close business deals. The voice that made powerful men nervous. Charlotte could only manage a faint whisper. "Graham, please, can we not do this here? Can we talk about this in private? There is nothing to discuss." He moved toward her. She could smell his cologne. It was Armani Code, the very same scent she bought for their 3rd anniversary. Now, the smell just made her feel sick. "You called Sienna a liar. You embarrassed her today at lunch in front of important business partners. In front of my world. I did not embarrass anyone." Charlotte's hands moved to cover her pregnant belly in a protective gesture. "I just asked her to please stop touching my husband. I asked for some respect for our marriage." Sienna let out a laugh from the sofa. It was a high, sharp sound, like fine crystal shattering against the marble floor. "See, Graham?" Sienna's voice was like poisoned honey. "I warned you she was the jealous type. I knew she would cause a scene. This is just so pathetic. A pregnant woman making wild accusations. So embarrassing." Charlotte felt her airway constrict. Her heart was beating so loudly it throbbed in her ears. This cannot be happening. This is not real. She was pregnant with his baby. They had been married for 4 years. She left her entire life for him, her marketing career, her friends, all of it. She gave him her whole world. And this is how he repaid her. Graham seized her arm. His fingers squeezed her flesh with a brutal force. She knew his grip would leave 5 dark bruises by morning. "You are going to apologize to Sienna," he seethed. "You will do it on your knees, like the pathetic wife you are." "Graham, I am pregnant." Charlotte's voice trembled. She despised how weak and fragile she sounded. "I am 8 months pregnant. I can barely even tie my own shoes. My doctor told me I have to be careful." He replied then, "Maybe this will teach you to think before you speak." He shoved her shoulder hard. Charlotte lost her balance. Her left knee slammed into the floor. A sharp pain electrified her leg. Her right knee hit the marble next. The baby kicked violently inside her, reacting to the jolt and her terror. She braced herself with one hand on the unforgiving floor. It was hard and cold. She looked up at her husband, the man she once loved and trusted, the man whose child she was carrying. He stared down at her, as if she were something disgusting on the bottom of his shoe. Sienna stood up from the sofa. She walked toward them with slow, measured steps. Her red-soled heels clicked on the marble, each one a countdown to her doom. She wore a stunning red dress by Valentino. Charlotte recognized it from a magazine. It had to cost $15,000. The money likely came from the joint bank account she thought they both shared. "Now apologize," Graham ordered. Charlotte felt tears sting her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She would not give them that satisfaction. Not in front of them. Not like this. Not forced to her knees in her own house. "I am sorry," she whispered. The words felt like ash in her mouth. He said, louder, "I need Sienna to hear you clearly. I am sorry for saying you were a liar." Sienna just smiled. It was the most cruel and wicked look Charlotte had ever seen. There was zero warmth in her eyes, only pure, cold victory. "See," Sienna said, stroking Graham's arm. "She can be taught, just like a little puppy. Perhaps she is not a hopeless case." They both laughed, standing above her as she knelt there, 8 months pregnant on the cold stone, while their baby restlessly turned inside her. Her knees were in agony, and her heart felt like it was breaking into 1,000 pieces. But there was something they did not know, something they could never imagine. Inside the pocket of her soft cashmere cardigan, Charlotte's phone was on. The voice memo application was actively recording everything. A tiny red light blinked silently against the dark fabric. It captured every cruel order, every mocking laugh, every single moment of her humiliation. In just 47 days, 12 million people would hear this very recording in a federal court. 12 million people hear Graham tell her to get on her knees. 12 million would hear Sienna's laugh. And 12 million people would know the kind of monster she had married. But Charlotte did not know that yet. At that moment, all she knew was the cold floor, the pain in her back, the frantic movements of her unborn child, and their laughter echoing in the huge, empty room. Graham took a step back. "You look disgusting down there." Charlotte slowly pushed herself to her feet. It was a struggle. Her balance was off, her belly was in the way, and her knee was throbbing. Her back felt like it was on fire. But she got up. She would always get back up. "I am taking Sienna out tonight," Graham announced, already turning his back on her. "We have reservations at Per Se. Do not bother waiting up." That was their special place. It was where he had proposed to her. It was where they celebrated every anniversary. And now, he was taking his mistress there. "The baby is due any day now," Charlotte said, not sure why she even tried. "The doctor said I should not be by myself. What if I go into labor?" Graham did not even bother to look back. "Then call your mother. That is her job." He and Sienna left, with her arm looped through his like a new handbag. The front door clicked shut. The deadbolt slid into place with a sound as final as a gunshot. Charlotte was left standing alone in the grand entryway, the same one she had designed with so much joy and naive hope for their future together. The baby's room was just down the hall. She had worked on it for 3 months. The walls were a soft, sunny yellow. The white crib was handmade in Sweden from special wood. A mobile of tiny silver stars played a gentle melody. By the window sat a rocking chair, the one where she dreamed of nursing their baby as the sun went down over Central Park. She had obsessed over every little thing, picturing the happy family they would become. She imagined this home filled with laughter and love. But now she knew the truth. There was no family. There never was one. To him, she was just a contract, a way to produce an heir. That was all there was to it. Charlotte moved toward the bathroom, one slow, careful step at a time. Pain shot from her knee, through her leg, and into her hip. The muscles in her back were tight knots. Her baby was motionless, as if she knew something dreadful had occurred. Charlotte stared at her own reflection. The mirror had a gold frame that cost $12,000. Graham had demanded they buy it. He said only the best was good enough for his wife. Back then it sounded like love, not like he owned her. Charlotte's face was ghost white. Her eyes were red but completely dry. The hair she had spent so long on that morning was now a mess. She saw an old, tired, and beaten woman. But she would not cry, she refused. She took out her phone and stopped the recording. 3 minutes and 47 seconds. It was 3 minutes and 47 seconds of proof. That little recording would change her entire life. Her hands shook so much, the phone almost fell. She had no idea what to do. She did not know where she could possibly go. Nothing about what just happened made any sense to her. Her thoughts were a chaotic mess, all crashing into one another. So, she did the one thing she always did when her world fell to pieces. It was what she did after her father passed away. It was what she did after she lost her very first job. She did it any time life felt like too much to handle. She walked to the garage and got into her car. It was a Mercedes SUV Graham bought her after she became pregnant. He said she needed a safe car for the baby. It was another present that felt more like a cage. She just sat there for 23 minutes. Charlotte sat inside her car, in the deep shadows of the parking garage. The concrete structure felt like it was closing in on her. The overhead lights made a constant, low humming sound. The air smelled of gasoline and old tires. She did not shed a tear. She felt like she could not. The tears were trapped somewhere inside her. Her body seemed to have shut down to protect itself. It locked away all the feelings that would break her. She just focused on her breathing, in and out, over and over. She placed her hands on her stomach. The baby kicked, but it was a softer, gentler kick this time. It felt like a question, a comfort, a tiny message saying, "I am right here, Mom. We are still here. No matter what comes next, we will face it together." Charlotte looked down at her growing belly under her expensive sweater. She looked at the new life that was developing. No matter what Graham Holt had done. "I know," she whispered into the quiet garage. "I know, my sweet baby girl. Your mama is going to handle this. I am not sure how just yet. I do not know when it will happen, but I promise you I will." She had no plan. She had no timeline. But in that moment, alone in a dark garage as her life shattered, Charlotte Weston made a choice. She would no longer be unseen. She would no longer be the quiet, obedient wife. She was finished being perfect for a man who treated her like a possession, like a simple tool to get what he wanted. A small voice echoed in the back of her mind. It was the voice of her grandmother. Eleanor Weston had raised Charlotte after her father died when she was 16. She was the one who taught her how to bake and how to manage her money. And she taught her to never let any man belittle her. Her grandmother used to say, with wisdom in her eyes, when a person shows you their true colors, you must believe them the very first time. Do not give them a second chance. Do not invent excuses for them. Never tell yourself things are going to improve. Just believe them. Graham had shown her his true self tonight. And now, Charlotte finally believed him. She turned on the car and the engine came to life. She backed out of the space and drove up toward the street. The lights of Manhattan sparkled all around her against the night sky. It was the city that was always awake. It was the city where fortunes were made and lives were ruined every day. At first, Charlotte had no idea where she was heading. She just drove by the huge city buildings, the fancy shops, and the dark, quiet park. Then she knew exactly where to go. She was going to see Harper. Harper was the one person who had never told her a lie. She always told Charlotte the truth, even when it was painful. Harper would know what she needed to do. Charlotte drove onto the Brooklyn Bridge, with its massive cables rising above her. The dark river flowed silently underneath. In her mirror, the city she left behind got smaller and smaller. The fancy apartment, the life she thought she had, the lies she believed. She did not feel sad about it. She did not even look back. She was too focused on getting away. Harper Finley answered her door at 11:47 at night. She wore pajamas decorated with little cats. Her red hair was in a messy pile on her head. She had obviously been sleeping, but as soon as she saw Charlotte's face, she was wide awake. She moved aside to let her in without saying anything. Charlotte entered the small apartment in Brooklyn. It was the opposite of her penthouse. It was 500 square feet, not 5,000. The furniture was from a normal store, not from Italy. There were books on every single surface. Harper was a librarian and books were her whole world. But the apartment smelled of lavender and old pages. It smelled safe. It felt like coming home. Harper said, "I will get us some wine." Then she stopped and looked at Charlotte's belly. "Oh wait, you cannot have wine. I will get ice cream instead." Charlotte collapsed onto the old, comfortable couch. Her entire body was in pain. Her knee was already bruised under her pants. Her back felt like it had been hit by a truck. A terrible headache was pounding in her head, and it had been getting worse all day since she saw those messages. Harper came back with 2 containers of mint chocolate chip ice cream and 2 spoons. She gave one of each to Charlotte. Then she sat on the far end of the couch, tucked her feet under her, and just waited. That was Harper's way. She never tried to force things. She did not demand answers. She never tried to fill the quiet with pointless talk. She simply waited, with patience and kindness, for you to be ready. They met as freshmen in college. Charlotte was a nervous girl from a small town, scared of the big city and being away from her family. Harper was her roommate, a girl on a scholarship from an even smaller town, who had never known anyone with so much money. They were not supposed to be friends. They were completely different. But in that small room with its plain walls and clean-smelling beds, they became the best of friends. Now, 20 years later, Harper was still the person Charlotte called when her world was ending. Charlotte took a deep breath, and then she told her the whole story. The doubts she had for months, the text messages she discovered on his tablet, the argument at lunch where she asked Sienna to respect her marriage, arriving home to see Sienna acting like she owned the apartment, Graham making her get on her knees, the recording she made on her phone. She told her every single part, every painful detail, every cruel word that was said, every laugh that felt like a sharp blade. Harper listened to the entire story quietly. Her expression got angrier with every new detail. She gripped her spoon so tightly, her knuckles turned white, but she stayed silent. She just listened. When Charlotte was done, there was a long silence between them. The sounds of the city came through the windows. A police car wailed nearby. From the apartment upstairs, someone was playing jazz music. The sound of a saxophone drifted down like smoke. Finally, Harper said something. "I have been holding my tongue for 3 years, Charlie." Her voice was strained with anger she had held back. 3 whole years. "It started at your rehearsal dinner when I saw him looking at the waitress, when I heard how he spoke to the parking attendant, when I realized he never once cared about your job, your passions, or your life." Charlotte just stared at her friend. "You never told me anything. Because you seemed happy, or at least you thought you were. And I did not have any real proof. I just had a bad feeling that grew stronger each time I saw you." Harper's eyes were filled with tears she would not let fall. "But I knew, Charlie. I knew he was not right. Graham Holt is a terrible person hidden inside an expensive suit. He is a monster who pretends to be a gentleman, and I am so sorry it took you this long to see it." Charlotte felt a huge weight lift from her shoulders. She had been so worried that Harper would blame her. She thought Harper would ask why she waited so long, or make her feel foolish for not noticing the clues. But Harper did not do that. She simply passed Charlotte another spoonful of ice cream and said what she desperately needed to hear. "You are not going crazy," Harper said, looking right at her. "You are sure about what you saw. You are sure about what he forced you to do. Do not let a single person make you think otherwise." Charlotte nodded slowly. Her throat was tight with a mix of feelings. "I am not crazy," she whispered. The words sounded new and powerful. "I know what I saw. I know what he forced me to do." They sat quietly for a little while. The ice cream was cool and sweet, and it was the perfect comfort. The apartment was warm and secure, filled with the comforting smell of old books. For the first time in what felt like forever, Charlotte felt she could actually breathe again. Then, Harper sat up a little taller. Her look of pity turned into one of pure focus. Charlotte knew that expression. It was the one Harper wore when she was tackling a puzzle. "We have to find out how bad this really is," Harper stated. "You saw texts on his phone, but that was only today. It was just by chance. What if there is more? What if this has been happening for much longer?" That idea had never occurred to Charlotte. The shock and pain of her discovery had been so overwhelming that she had not even considered looking for more evidence of his betrayal. "The iPad," she said out of nowhere. Harper looked at her with a questioning gaze. "What about an iPad?" "Graham has a family iPad. He created it a long time ago for us to share photos, calendars, and grocery lists. But he forgot that it syncs with his iCloud. His messages, his pictures, his search history. Everything is saved automatically." Harper was already getting up. "Do you know the password?" "Our anniversary, August 14th, Charlotte said with a bitter laugh. Naturally, he'd use your anniversary for the password to a device holding proof of his cheating. These men are unbelievably arrogant. They honestly believe they will never be caught. They discovered the iPad inside Charlotte's travel bag. She had made a habit of keeping it with her to check Graham's schedule and know when he would be home. Now she was thankful for that routine. Charlotte's hand shook as she entered the password. The device unlocked, showing the standard home screen with its icons for photos, messages, and calendars. She tapped on the Messages application. The texts appeared slowly at first, then flooded the screen in a waterfall of deceit. There were hundreds of them. Thousands of messages, all from Sienna, all sent to Graham. They went back not just for months, but for 2 whole years. The affair had been going on for 2 years, starting even before their wedding. "Oh my goodness," Harper breathed out. She was looking over Charlotte's shoulder, her face suddenly pale. "Charlie, you need to see this one." Charlotte looked, and her heart felt like it stopped beating. The message was from 3 weeks before their wedding day, June 21st. Charlotte recalled that day clearly. She was at her final fitting for her wedding dress. She had been filled with joy and excitement, completely unaware of the truth. Sienna's message read, "When will you finally tell her? I am getting tired of waiting." Graham had replied, "After the baby is born. I need the heir first. The family name, the connections, the respectability. Once I have secured all that, we can sort out the details. Just have a little patience." Charlotte just stared at the screen. The words became a blur, then came into focus and blurred once more. That is all her child meant to him. A successor, an item on a business plan, a way to continue the Holt family line, a strategic move. He had never been in love with her. He had never truly wanted her. He had wanted the Weston family name, her family's social ties, her mother's wealth, and her father's reputation. He wanted the opportunities it would create, and the business deals it would secure. Graham Holt had married into one of America's most prominent families. Charlotte's father was a federal judge, highly respected in the Second Circuit, and his name still held influence, even 10 years after his passing. Her mother was from a wealthy family, the Ellsworths, whose fortune had been growing for many generations. Graham had recognized a golden opportunity, and he seized it. Charlotte realized she was not his wife. She was a business deal, a merger, a hostile takeover disguised as a romance. Charlotte found herself sitting on Harper's bathroom floor. She could not recall walking in there. She did not remember leaving the sofa, walking through the small apartment, or shutting the door. But there she was, on the cold tiles, surrounded by Harper's personal items and the simple things of a normal life. Her hands were trembling. Her entire body was trembling. She had to do something. Anything at all. Something to make the shaking go away. Something to feel like she had control over some part of her life. She began to organize the items in Harper's medicine cabinet. It was a strange thing to do, and she knew it. But her hands needed a task. Her mind needed something to focus on besides text messages and betrayal and the complete ruin of her marriage. She sorted the medicine bottles by their size, with the tallest ones at the back. She put the labels in alphabetical order: Advil, aspirin, Benadryl, melatonin. She folded the small towels into perfect squares and made a neat pile. She arranged the cotton balls in straight lines. She organized the hair ties by their color. She turned the toothpaste tubes so all the labels faced forward. It was a completely absurd and ridiculous task, but it was helping her. Harper discovered her there 20 minutes later. She did not speak at first, but simply sat on the cold floor beside Charlotte. She let the silence fill the space between them, allowing Charlotte to organize and control something in a world that felt completely out of control. At last, Charlotte said, "He never loved me." "I know, sweetie. He just used me." "I know. I feel so foolish, Harper." Charlotte's voice broke, but she did not cry. The tears just would not come. All the warning signs were there. The way he spoke about my family as if they were business assets. The way he always made a point to mention my father's name at events. The way he insisted on having a baby so soon after we got married, before we had even settled into being a couple. Charlotte finally turned to her friend. Her eyes were dry but filled with pain. I was a corporate merger. That is all I ever was to him. A corporate merger in a wedding dress. Harper grabbed her hand and held it tightly. Her grip felt warm and strong and real. "You need to listen to me," Harper said, her voice full of passion. "None of this is your fault. He deceived you. He manipulated you. He is a monster in a $3,000 suit. And monsters are experts at hiding their true nature. That is how they trap their victims." She squeezed Charlotte's hand even tighter. "You did not see the truth because he did not want you to see it. He spent years creating a perfect disguise, and he only removed it when he believed you were too stuck to ever escape. That is not being foolish. That is being a victim of a professional manipulator." Charlotte nodded her head slowly. The words were logical and true, but they did not bring her any comfort. "What am I supposed to do now?" she asked, her voice quiet and lost. "Where do I even begin?" Harper's gentle expression vanished. It was replaced by a look of fierce determination and strength. It was the same look she had when she fought for library funding, or when she defended a controversial book, or when she stood up for what was right. First, Harper declared, "We are going to save every single one of those messages on the iPad. Take screenshots, back it up to the cloud, email them to yourself, do everything. Make several copies and store them in different places where Graham cannot get to them." Charlotte nodded. "Then, we are going to find you the absolute best divorce lawyer in Manhattan. Someone who is not intimidated by billionaires. Someone who knows how to play rough if necessary." "Graham knows all the top lawyers," Charlotte said, her voice empty. "Half of them are already working for Holt Industries. The other half are terrified of him. Then we will find a lawyer he does not know. Someone from outside his circle. Someone who has nothing to lose and is eager to make a name for themselves." Charlotte considered this. A person who was not afraid of Graham Holt. Could such a person even exist in Manhattan? Her phone made a buzzing sound. She took it out and read the screen. It was a text from Graham. "Do not bother coming home tonight. Sienna is staying over. You can sleep somewhere else." Charlotte stared at the words. A change happened inside her. The fear was still present. The pain was still there, raw and deep. But another feeling was starting to surface. It was pure, righteous anger. Graham believed he had defeated her. He thought that making her kneel had completely broken her spirit. He expected her to come crawling back to him, thankful for any little bit of attention he might give her. He thought she would beg for his forgiveness and apologize for being an inconvenience. He was completely mistaken. Charlotte typed a reply. It was just 3 words, simple, direct, and final. "Good luck." Then she blocked his number. Harper glanced at the phone screen. A slow smile appeared on her face. "There she is," Harper said. "That is the Charlie I remember. The one who earned a 4.0 GPA while holding down 2 jobs. The one who stood up to that sexist professor in our junior year. The Charlie who never gave up on anything." Charlotte did not feel like the person she used to be. She felt like a new person, someone tougher, shaped by fire and heartache and betrayal. But perhaps that was a good thing. Maybe she had to become someone different to get through what was ahead. She now realized this would not be a peaceful divorce. This was not going to be an amicable separation. Graham would use all his resources against her. His wealth, his attorneys, his influence, and his connections. But she possessed something that he did not. She had the truth. She had solid proof. She had a recording that would bring about his downfall. And in 45 days, that truth would force him to his knees, just as he had forced her to hers. The Ellsworth family brownstone had been passed down through 4 generations of Charlotte's family. It was located on a quiet, tree-lined street on the Upper East Side, surrounded by similar homes owned by families with similar histories. It was old money, discreet wealth, the kind of riches that did not need to be shown off because all the important people were already aware of it. Charlotte's mother, Margot Ellsworth Weston, had spent her entire life in that house. She was born in the main bedroom on the 2nd floor. She married Charlotte's father in the garden behind the house. She raised Charlotte and her brother inside those very walls. She held her husband's funeral in the front parlor and continued on with her life, enduring and surviving. Charlotte faced her mother in the formal parlor. Untouched tea sat in heirloom cups, cold as the mood. Sunlight cut across a rug older than the Civil War, creating long, dark shadows. Her mother, Margot, was 58 years old. Her silver hair was a point of pride, a symbol of survival. She would never die. She wore her pearls everywhere, whether buying groceries or walking the dog. Her composure was a family trait, a silent belief that dignity was paramount and feelings were kept hidden. But Charlotte knew that beneath the calm was a core of steel. She saw it after her father's fatal heart attack at 52. Relatives and lawyers circled like vultures, assuming a widow was an easy target. Margot dismissed them all with quiet, ruthless efficiency. They never got a single cent of the Weston fortune. Charlotte explained it all to her mother. She spoke of the affair, the cruel messages, the recording, and the humiliation. She revealed every painful detail in the home where she once believed in lifelong love. Through the entire awful story, Margot listened. Her expression never once changed. The only sign of emotion was how tightly she held her teacup. After Charlotte fell silent, the room was still for a long time. The old grandfather clock ticked, and a distant car horn blared. The world outside was oblivious. Then, Margot finally spoke. "I looked into Graham's past before you were engaged." Charlotte felt the blood leave her face as her hands turned to ice. Her heart felt like it stopped. "What?" she whispered, the word barely audible. Margot's blue eyes locked with her daughter's, a perfect match. Charlotte had always been proud to look just like her mother. Now she wondered if she shared her mother's instincts and why hers had been so wrong. "I hired a private investigator," Margot went on. Her voice was level, but underneath lay a deep regret. "It was the pain of knowing you could have stopped a disaster but failed to act. For 3 months I had his entire life investigated," she said. "His business, his past relationships, everything. Why didn't you say anything?" Charlotte's voice was filled with hurt. "If you suspected him, because there was no solid proof." For the first time, Margot's perfect composure broke. Her voice shook. "I found strange patterns. Women who quit working for him without explanation. There were secret settlements and legal agreements nobody would talk about. It was all suspicious, but I had nothing I could actually prove. It was not enough to convince a happy woman that her future husband was dangerous." Charlotte looked at the mother, who had always been her protector, the one who always knew best, the one who let her marry a man she suspected. "You knew he was a risk," Charlotte said, her voice hollow. "You knew, and you let me do it. But you were so incredibly happy," Margot replied. A single tear rolled down Margot's cheek. She brushed it away fast, almost angry with herself for showing weakness. "You were completely in love. You floated after your first date. All you did was talk about him and your future. I hadn't seen you that joyful since before your father passed away." Margot's voice cracked with emotion. "I had suspicions, not proof. I told myself I was just being a worried mother. I thought I was imagining things." Charlotte wanted to scream. She felt a burning anger. She felt betrayed by her husband and now by her own mother too. More than angry, she was just exhausted, down to her bones. "That is in the past," Charlotte finally said. "We need to focus on what happens now." Margot agreed. From her pocket, she produced a business card. It was made of thick, expensive, cream-colored paper. "Bennett Shaw," Margot stated, pushing the card towards her daughter. "He is the top divorce lawyer on the East Coast, maybe the best in the nation. He has won 3 of the biggest cases in the last 10 years. He represents clients against powerful men with endless money and legal teams." Charlotte held the card. The name was simple and elegant, embossed in gold lettering. "He has a perfect record," Margot said. "Does Graham know of him?" "No, Bennett operates differently. He does not advertise or attend fancy events. People find him by word of mouth when they have an impossible case that only he can win." Charlotte studied her mother's face, seeing the worry lines and the tension she tried to conceal. "You have been planning for this," Charlotte stated. "It was not a question." "I have been preparing," her mother corrected her gently. "There is a very big difference. I truly hoped you would never see this card. I prayed that I was wrong about Graham. I wanted my fears to be nothing more than a mother's paranoia. I just wanted you to be happy." She paused. "But I saved his card just in case. That is a mother's job. We hope for the best, but we prepare for the worst." 3 days later, Charlotte was in Bennett Shaw's Midtown office. It was high up on the 34th floor, with a view of Central Park. The walls displayed his victories. Framed articles told stories of historic wins, of powerful men defeated, and of justice served when all hope seemed lost. Bennett was 45 years old, with salt and pepper hair and an unreadable face. His dark eyes were sharp and missed no detail. He wore an expensive, understated suit. He radiated competence, confidence, and an unbreakable will. He listened to her entire story with his hands clasped on the desk. His face remained a mask. It did not change when she mentioned the affair or the kneeling. Then, she played the recording from her phone. "Get on your knees." Graham's cold, cruel voice suddenly filled the quiet office. Charlotte searched Bennett's face for any sign of a reaction. As the recording continued, she finally saw one. A flicker of something in his eyes. His jaw muscles clenched tightly. A nerve in his cheek jumped. The recording finished with her own broken voice. "I am sorry for accusing you of lying." Her trembling words faded away. Bennett said nothing for a moment. When he spoke, his tone was measured. "Holt, Weston," Charlotte cut in firmly. "I am using Weston again. I refuse to be associated with that other name." Bennett gave a single nod. His eyes showed deep respect. "Weston," he explained, "your husband's actions were emotional abuse and coercive control. Considering your pregnancy, it was also reckless endangerment. That recording can be used as evidence in New York. This state has very strong laws to protect people in your situation." "And the text messages?" Charlotte asked. "The ones that show he planned everything?" "They prove this was premeditated," Bennett said. "This was not a sudden act of passion or a man breaking under pressure. Graham Holt intended to use you from the very start. The wedding, the baby, it was all part of his deliberate plan." Charlotte knew it was true, but hearing it described in cold legal language made it feel terrifyingly real. "So what is our next step?" she asked. Bennett leaned across his desk, his gaze intense. "We will do more than just divorce him, miss. We are going to completely expose him. We will reveal every single lie, every single trick, and every other woman he has harmed. The world will learn who Graham Holt truly is. After that, his wealth and influence will mean nothing." A tight knot in Charlotte's chest finally began to unwind. She could almost breathe again. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt a glimmer of hope. "But won't he fight us?" she asked. "He is incredibly wealthy and connected. He knows powerful people in politics, law, and the media." "Yes, he is," Bennett confirmed. "And he will use every advantage he has to try and ruin you. He will question your character, your mind, and your ability to be a mother. He will spend a fortune to slander your name." Bennett paused and then smiled, a sharp and confident grin. "But influence only gets you so far. The truth is powerful. Once that recording is heard in court and the world knows what he did, his reputation will be destroyed." She gave a slow nod. She needed to trust him. "There is something else," she said. "Something you must understand before this goes any further." "What is that?" Charlotte rested her hands on her belly. Her baby kicked hard and sure, as if backing her up. "I am not doing this for revenge," she said, her voice soft but strong. "This is not about wanting to hurt Graham. This is for my daughter. She deserves so much more. She deserved to know her mother did not just accept being treated like an object. She deserved a world where women stand up for themselves." She looked Bennett straight in the eye. "I want my daughter to learn that powerful people can be held accountable. I want her to know that truth is important and justice can be found." She added, "No one is above the consequences of their actions." Bennett was silent for a second. A flicker of real emotion crossed his face. "That is exactly the kind of client I prefer to represent," he finally said. "Let us begin." For the next 3 hours, they went over every detail. They reviewed the affair's timeline, the iPad messages, and the recording. They looked at her finances, her assets, and the prenuptial agreement Graham had demanded. She now saw it was only to protect his money. When Charlotte left his office, her mind was racing. But for the first time in a very long time, she felt a glimmer of hope. She walked out onto Fifth Avenue. The busy city surrounded her, completely unaware of her quiet victory. Taxis blared their horns. Tourists snapped pictures. Business people rushed by, glued to their phones. Life just went on. The world continued to spin. High above the city, in a penthouse that was once her prison, Graham Holt had no clue what was about to happen. Charlotte looked at her phone and saw a message from Harper. It asked, "How did it go?" For the first time in days, a genuine smile touched Charlotte's lips. "We are starting a war," she replied, "and we are going to win." Graham Holt did not handle the news of the divorce well. Charlotte discovered this just 3 days after her meeting when her private banker called. "I am so sorry, Mrs. Holt," the banker said. His voice was perfectly rehearsed, full of professional regret. "But we have received a court order. Your personal accounts have been frozen while a legal matter is sorted out." Charlotte felt her hands grow cold as she held the phone. "I do not understand. Those accounts are only in my name. They are not connected to my husband." The banker replied, "I understand, ma'am, but an emergency motion was filed with the court. It mentions something about the misuse of marital money. Until the court resolves it, we are legally not allowed to process any payments. I am truly sorry." Charlotte ended the call. She was staying in her mother's guest room since that horrible night. She just stared at the wall, at the delicate floral wallpaper full of roses and peonies. She chose that wallpaper herself at 16, just after her father passed away. Her mother let her redecorate the room to help with her sadness. Now, she was 32 years old, hiding from her husband in that same room. The flowers on the wall seemed to be mocking her. Graham was trying to starve her of resources. He wanted to cut her off and force her to depend on him again, to bring her back under his thumb. Charlotte called Bennett right away. "This is a classic move," Bennett told her. His voice was steady and calm, like he was expecting it. "The first thing a controlling person does when they lose power is to go after the money. It is textbook controlling behavior. Take away the funds, and you take away their freedom. But now I cannot access anything. The baby is due in 3 weeks. I have appointments and bills to pay. I cannot even buy food," Bennett replied. "Your mother has established a trust. I talked to her lawyer this morning. You will have money available within 24 hours. Graham's lawyers can try whatever they want. They can make threats and waste everyone's time, but they cannot touch money that is not part of the marriage. The Ellsworth Trust is 3 generations older than your wedding." Charlotte let out a long breath. The tightness in her chest eased a little. "He is just going to keep doing things like this, is he not?" she asked, "finding new ways to attack me. He will keep trying to surprise me." "Yes," Bennett answered honestly. He never softened the truth, which she was starting to like about him. This is how he operates. He will fight dirty, because that is the only way he knows how. But you need to remember this. He paused, and his voice became harder. "You need to understand something. Every aggressive step he takes, every nasty little action, every single attempt to scare you, it all just becomes more evidence against him. It proves to the court who he really is. Let him dig his own grave. Let him show the judge he is the kind of man who would force his pregnant wife to her knees. We will be right there to help push him in." Later that day, Graham's public relations team sent a statement to the media. Charlotte read it on her phone in her mother's kitchen, her tea growing cold. Harper had taken the afternoon off from the library to be with her. In the other room, her mother, Margot, was on the phone with her own lawyer. Graham Holt is deeply saddened by his wife's choice to end their marriage. He wants only the best for her and their unborn child. He hopes for a peaceful co-parenting relationship and asks for privacy. Charlotte read it over and over. Each time she felt a wave of sickness. The statement was perfectly crafted. It made Graham look like the victim of a wife who suddenly decided to ruin their life. It brought up their unborn child, making Graham seem like a caring, concerned father who just wanted things to be calm. It was a beautiful lie, like poison in a fancy glass. The comments online were awful. "Another gold digger after a rich man's fortune. She probably cheated and is making up stories. Poor Graham. He always seemed so kind. Women like her give the rest of us a bad name. She marries a billionaire and then claims he abused her." Harper snatched the phone and threw it. "Do not read those comments," she ordered. Never, ever read the comments. Those people have no idea who you are. They do not know what really happened. It is all just meaningless noise. Charlotte nodded, but the poison was already in her mind. Gold digger, liar, abuser. The public had already judged her without knowing any facts. She hoped the recording might change their minds. When they heard Graham's voice say, "Get on your knees," and heard Sienna laugh in the background, she really hoped so, but she was not sure anymore. The other comments were almost worse. Poor Charlotte. She must be terrified. I hope she finds help. We need to show sympathy for victims. Bless her sweet heart. She appears so fragile. They felt sorry for her. They saw her as a victim, a damsel in distress who needed to be saved. But Charlotte was not helpless. She was not fragile. She was not a victim waiting for a rescuer. She was a woman who had been knocked to the ground but was getting back on her feet. She was a woman who was fighting back, a woman who would never kneel again. But nobody seemed to want that version of her story. They preferred either the sobbing victim or the scheming gold digger. There was no room for anything else. Later that night, around 2 a.m, Harper found Charlotte in the kitchen. Flour dusted the countertops. The warm scent of cinnamon and apples hung in the air. Charlotte was rolling out pie dough with robotic, practiced movements. "What are you doing?" Harper asked, her eyes still sleepy. "I am making my grandmother's apple pie," Charlotte answered, her voice empty and distant. "It is the only thing that feels logical to me right now." Harper took a seat at the counter. She watched her friend work, silently observing her roll the dough and peel the apples. She mixed the cinnamon and brown sugar with a touch of nutmeg, just as her grandma Eleanor had shown her. "You know, it is okay to not be strong all the time," Harper said softly. Charlotte's hands paused on the rolling pin. "Yes, I do have to be," she finally replied. Her voice wavered, but she held back tears. "Because if I stop being strong, even for a moment, I will completely break down. And I cannot do that. Not right now. Not with this baby on the way. And with Graham trying to ruin me. I have to keep myself together." She returned to her dough, and the kitchen was filled with the steady rhythm of her work. The smell of butter and sugar, and the warmth from the preheating oven. "This is what Grandma Eleanor always did," Charlotte said quietly. "When Grandpa died, when my dad died, whenever something awful happened, she would bake. She said it was the only time her hands knew what to do, even when her heart was confused." Harper's eyes filled with tears. "Your grandmother was a very wise woman. She was the strongest person I have ever known." Charlotte's voice cracked a little. "I am trying so hard to be like her. I am trying, but sometimes I am not sure if I can do this." Harper stood up, walked over and wrapped her arms around her friend from behind. "You can do this," Harper murmured gently, "and you are not going through it by yourself." Charlotte didn't touch the pie after it was baked, but the process helped. Doing something with her hands gave her a sense of control when her world was in chaos. It was a link to her grandmother, her history, and the strong women who came before her. She put a cover on the pie, leaving it on the kitchen counter. Perhaps her mother would eat a slice in the morning, or maybe not. It made no difference. The act of creating it was what mattered. The following week, 2 things happened. The first was a meeting with a journalist, Vera Morrison, which Harper had arranged. Vera was a writer for The Atlantic, a highly respected magazine. She was 43 years old, with sharp eyes and a reputation for dismantling powerful men. Her past work had exposed a tech executive, a university head, and a famous television preacher. Each one of them had ended up in disgrace. Their meeting took place in a small coffee shop. Charlotte wore a hat and sunglasses, feeling absurd, like a spy in a cheap film. Bennett had warned her that Graham likely had people watching her. He had men paid to find information and exploit any weakness. Vera did not waste any time. "I have been looking into Graham Holt's business dealings for 18 months, she stated. Her voice was quiet but intense. "His financial methods, the way he treats his workers, how he eliminates rivals and hides problems. I am sure he is corrupt, but his lawyers are too skilled to prove it. Everything he does is technically lawful, even if it is completely wrong." "Then why are we meeting?" Charlotte inquired. "Because this is not the same." Vera leaned closer, her eyes shining with focus. "The pattern of mistreatment, the careful planning, the evidence you possess. Charlotte, this is much bigger than your divorce. It is about how powerful and use marriage as a weapon. They use women to get ahead and then cast them aside. They escape consequences because of their wealth, their influence, and their teams of attorneys and public relations experts. Charlotte was silent for a while. She swirled the cream in her coffee, making patterns that vanished instantly. "If I tell my story," she said carefully, "my daughter's name will always be linked to it. Every time she is searched online, this will appear. For every school application, every job, every new relationship, they will read about how her father made his pregnant wife kneel." "Correct," Vera replied. She did not soften the truth, and Charlotte appreciated that. That is the price. You must determine if you can pay it. "But if I do not speak, then Graham gets away with it. He continues his life as if nothing occurred. And other women could face the same abuse I did. Other partners, other women he meets who do not recognize the danger he poses until it is too late." Vera agreed with a nod. That is also correct. Charlotte thought of her unborn daughter, Eleanor, and the world she would enter. A world where men like Graham are never held accountable, where they could harm a pregnant woman and continue their lives without a scratch. A world where influence and money could hide any crime and silence any voice. Or a world where women stood up, shared their truths no matter the difficulty, and refused to be quieted by powerful people. Charlotte made up her mind. "I will do the interview," she declared, "but only after the baby arrives. After I have recovered and feel strong enough for what comes next." Vera nodded in understanding. She reached out and squeezed Charlotte's hand. "You are much braver than you realize," Vera told her. Charlotte was not convinced. She did not feel brave at all. She felt an overwhelming sense of dread and exhaustion. It felt like she was barely keeping it together. But she had realized something important recently. It was something her grandmother had told her long ago. Courage was not about being free from fear. Courage was feeling the fear and still choosing to do what was right. She drank the last of her coffee, pulled her hat down, and walked onto the freezing Manhattan streets. Her baby was due in 3 weeks. She had 3 weeks to prepare for the biggest battle of her life. She was as prepared as she could be. Her water broke at the absolute worst time. Charlotte was at a fundraising event. It was the Hartwell Foundation's yearly gala for children's reading programs. The event was held in a stunning ballroom at the Pierre Hotel. There were crystal lights, white tablecloths, women in expensive dresses, and men in formal suits. It was the kind of night where fortunes were given away, and everyone acted like they cared. Charlotte had made herself go for a single reason. Graham was going to be there. She needed him to see she was not in hiding, that she felt no shame, and that his efforts to control her had not succeeded. She planned to enter that room with her head held high, showing him she was no longer afraid. She had taken 2 hours to get ready, with Harper's help. They picked a deep green dress that flowed over Charlotte's belly at 8.5 months pregnant. It was a classy and refined dress that drew attention without seeking it. Harper had styled Charlotte's hair in an elaborate way she had found on the internet. Her makeup was flawless, but understated. She looked stunning, and she knew it. She wanted Graham to see exactly what he had thrown away. She saw him as soon as she entered the large room. He was standing by the bar, holding a glass of whiskey. Sienna stood next to him in a red dress that was too revealing for a charity function. The two of them were laughing. Sienna's hand rested on Graham. "Charlotte, you are absolutely glowing. Motherhood looks wonderful on you. When is the big day? You must be thrilled." She just smiled and nodded, making conversation, hiding that her life was in ruins, hiding that she was planning to destroy the man she saw there. Then she felt it. A sudden warmth, a wetness spreading through her dress, a tightening in her belly that was not a false alarm. Please, not at this moment. Not in this place, with all these people watching. But her baby had a different idea. Charlotte grabbed onto the bar for support. Her vision blurred, and the colors all ran together. The huge chandelier lights above her began to spin like stars. A woman beside her let out a gasp. "Oh my goodness, did your water just break?" Charlotte glanced down. Her beautiful emerald dress was getting darker around her legs. A small pool was spreading on the marble floor. Her water had broken right here at the Pierre Hotel, in front of 700 guests, in front of Graham and Sienna and everyone she knew. "Someone should call for an ambulance," she heard herself say. Her own voice sounded surprisingly calm, like it belonged to a stranger. The baby is on its way. Everything after that was pure chaos. People started rushing around, pulling out their phones. Cameras flashed as reporters documented the moment's tespers and websites. Women in fancy dresses moved away from the growing puddle. Men in tuxedos just looked awkward, not knowing how to react to this messy, real-life moment. In all the confusion, Charlotte saw Graham's face for a second. He looked absolutely horrified. He was not concerned about her or their baby, not worried if she was all right. He was just horrified that his personal mess was now a public show, that his perfect image was being ruined by his wife giving birth while his mistress watched. Sienna's expression was a mixture of surprise and deep satisfaction. It was as if she was happy to see this happen. It was as if she wanted to see Charlotte suffer. She seemed to think this public shame was exactly what Charlotte deserved. Charlotte tucked those images away in her mind. She would deal with them later, because she had bigger things to worry about now. The ambulance came within minutes. They placed Charlotte on a stretcher. Her emerald dress was completely ruined, and her perfect makeup was streaked with sweat. The emergency medical team was gentle and professional. They asked about her contractions, the timing, and how far along she was. She tried to answer them, but her mind was on the pictures that were already all over the internet. Charlotte Weston in her green dress being taken to the hospital. Graham and Sienna just standing there in the background. The story was telling itself. The gossip magazines would love this. And for the first time, Charlotte simply did not care. Her labor lasted for 17 hours. 17 long hours of pain and pressure, feeling like her body was being ripped open from the inside. For 17 hours, she squeezed her mother's hand until her own knuckles turned white. For 17 hours, Harper guided her breathing, wiped her face with a cool cloth, and told her how incredibly she was doing. She was so powerful. The end was so close. Graham finally made an appearance at the hospital around the 8th hour. Charlotte learned the details later from the security guard Bennett had posted. Apparently, Graham had barged into the maternity ward like he owned it, which in a way he did. The Holt family had funded the wing's new equipment 5 years ago. A plaque with their name was displayed in the lobby. "She is my wife," Graham had shouted at the nurses. "That is my child. I have every right to be in there." But the guard, a former Marine named Marcus, was not swayed. "Sir, Mrs. Weston specifically asked for no visitors. You are not on the approved list. Do you even know who I am? I will have you fired. I will shut this entire hospital down." Marcus's voice had been calm and almost cheerful. "You can certainly try, sir. But for now, you need to leave this floor. If you do not go on your own, I will call the police, and the tabloids will get an even bigger story." Graham stormed off, his face reportedly flushed with fury. Charlotte wished she had seen it, but she was busy with more important matters. At 4:27 in the morning, after 17 hours of labor, Eleanor Charlotte Weston came into the world. She weighed 7 pounds, 2 ounces. She had a full head of dark hair, 10 perfect fingers, 10 perfect toes, a tiny mouth, and eyes that would likely be blue like Charlotte's. Dr. Patricia Brennan gently laid the baby on Charlotte's chest. The weight felt incredibly light, precious, and perfect. "She is beautiful," Dr. Brennan said softly. "You did a wonderful job, Charlotte. You were so very strong." Charlotte looked down at her daughter, this tiny being who had grown inside her for 9 months. This little girl had been with her through everything. Eleanor had been there through it all, growing and waiting, and now she was finally here. "Eleanor," Charlotte whispered, "after my grandmother. We will call you Ellie." The baby opened her eyes. They were the deep, dark blue of all newborns, a color that would later change. But Charlotte saw something in them already, something determined and strong. She saw a spirit that would not be controlled or belittled. "You will know your value from your very first breath," Charlotte whispered to her baby. Tears streamed down her face, the first she had shed since that terrible night. "No man will ever make you feel insignificant. No one will ever make you apologize for being yourself. I promise you that, Eleanor. I promise." The baby made a little noise, not a cry, but more like a sound of agreement. Charlotte hugged her daughter, smelling that sweet newborn scent, and felt whole for the first time in months. A nurse entered a few hours later carrying paperwork. Charlotte had managed to get some sleep. Eleanor was resting in a small crib next to her bed. Harper was asleep in the chair by the window. Margot had gone home to shower, promising to bring back real food to replace the hospital meals. "We need to complete the birth certificate," the nurse said gently. "I am sorry to disturb you, but some of these forms are urgent." Charlotte took the clipboard and looked at the paper. It asked for the child's name, date of birth, time of birth, mother's name, and then the father's name. Charlotte stared at that empty line, the space where Graham Holt's name was supposed to be. Legally, it probably had to be there. The affair, the cruel messages, and his plan to use her from the start. She remembered the humiliation, the frozen bank accounts, the public lies, and how he showed up at the hospital. He demanded to see Eleanor as if she were a piece of property. Her pen paused just above the paper. Then, with a steady hand and without any doubt, she wrote a single word, unknown. She knew it was a petty thing to do. Bennett would likely say it was a bad move that would make the custody battle harder. Graham's lawyers would surely use it against her. But it was also the absolute truth in every way that counted. Graham was never a true father. He never even wanted to be one. He did not want a daughter. He wanted an heir to continue the Holt dynasty. He wanted a name for his legal papers, not a child to love and care for. Eleanor deserved a father who actually wanted her, or she was better off with no father at all. Charlotte gave the form back to the nurse. The nurse glanced at it and her eyebrows went up, but she remained silent. She just nodded and walked out. The official birth certificate was filed the following day. A copy was sent to Graham's lawyers for the custody case. According to Bennett, his reaction was explosive. "He is demanding a paternity test," Bennett told her over the phone. Charlotte was still in the hospital, with Eleanor sleeping in her arms. "He's threatening to sue you for defamation and for parental alienation." It is the usual angry response from a man who is not used to being told no. Charlotte looked down at her daughter's tiny, peaceful face. "Let him try to sue," Charlotte declared. Her voice was steady and full of conviction. "He can demand anything he likes. He can use every legal trick he knows. I am not scared of him any longer." And she truly meant it. As she looked at Eleanor, Charlotte realized something new. She was not by herself. She would not be by herself ever again. She had this little person who relied on her completely, who trusted her, who needed her to be powerful. She had her mother, who had been waiting for this day for so many years. She had Harper, who left everything to be there with her. She had Bennett, a lawyer who had never been defeated and did not plan to be. Graham had his fortune. He had influence and powerful friends. But Charlotte had something far greater. She had the truth on her side. She had love. She had a daughter worth fighting for, and her battle was only just beginning. 6 weeks after Eleanor was born, Charlotte got a call from a number she did not know. She was in her mother's sunny room, nursing the baby. Eleanor was growing bigger and more alert each day. She had even started to smile, real smiles that lit up her entire face and filled Charlotte's heart with love. The caller ID was unfamiliar. She normally would not have answered, but for some reason, she did. "Weston, this is Deacon Holt." Charlotte almost dropped her phone. Deacon Holt was Graham's father, the man who created the Holt Empire. He had built a fortune and raised a terrible son. Charlotte had only met him 4 times. He had always looked at her as if she were just another expensive object in the house. "Holt," she said cautiously, "I am surprised that you are calling me. I am sure you are." His voice was old and weak, but she could hear the strength underneath. It was the same strength that had built an empire and crushed his rivals. "I would like to meet with you in private. There is something that you should know." Charlotte's mind raced. She was sure it was a trap. Deacon was obviously working with his son, Graham. This was just another scheme to trick her. "Why would I ever trust you?" she asked him. "You should not," he replied, and she heard a hint of respect in his voice. "You should not trust anyone associated with my son. But the information I have could help you. And it seems to me you need all the help you can find right now." Charlotte considered her options. Her instincts told her it was a bad idea, that she should hang up and call Bennett. But something in Deacon's tone made her pause. It sounded like regret, like a man who finally saw the truth about his life. "Where?" she finally asked. There is a small diner in Queens, Margie's on Roosevelt Avenue. It has been there since 1953. Nobody will know who we are. I will be there on Thursday at 2. 2 days later, Charlotte entered Margie's diner. It was just as she had pictured it. The place had old vinyl booths and worn-out counters. Deacon Holt was waiting in a booth at the back of the diner. He seemed smaller and much older than she remembered. He used a cane to walk, and his hand shook a little as he held his coffee cup. But his sharp, blue eyes were the same as Graham's, with the same cold look. It was like seeing what Graham might become in 30 years. That is, if he lived that long. Charlotte sat down across from him. A waitress came over, poured her a coffee without asking, and then walked away. "Thank you for meeting me," Deacon said. "Thank you for the invitation," Charlotte replied coldly. "Now please tell me why I am here." Deacon paused for a moment. He held his cup with his spotted, trembling hands, trying to absorb its warmth. He stared out the window at the busy street, at the regular people living their lives. It was a world completely different from the one he knew. "My son has brought shame to this family," he said at last. "For probably decades, I knew about the affairs and the hush money. I saw the women who vanished and never explained why. The signs were there for anyone willing to see them." Charlotte felt a chill run down her spine. How many of them were there? "After 12, I quit counting." Deacon's voice was empty, as if he was talking about company profits, not people. "I convinced myself it was not my place to interfere. Graham's private life was his own affair. As long as the business was doing well and the whole name was respected, nothing else mattered. But now I have seen the video." Deacon looked up and made eye contact with Charlotte. For the first time, she noticed a spark of humanity in his cold blue eyes. It was a look that seemed almost like shame. "I watched my own son push a pregnant woman to her knees. I heard him tell her to apologize in that specific tone. It was the same tone I taught him to use for business deals, for takeovers, and for destroying his rivals." He stopped, his jaw clenching. "And it hit me that I taught him how to treat others this way. I showed him that power is the only thing that matters. I taught him that money fixes all problems, and that rules are for other people. I made him believe empathy was a weakness." Charlotte just looked at the old man. The rage she anticipated never came. Instead, she felt tired and a strange, sad sense of connection. "Why are you telling me all this?" she asked. Deacon took a small black flash drive from his jacket. He slid it to her side of the table. 40 years of documents, he stated. "Every woman Graham abused, every payment made, and every secrecy agreement is on here. It has names, dates, and amounts. It is a record of the patterns his lawyers worked for decades to hide." Charlotte lifted the drive. It felt like nothing, but she knew exactly what it meant. It was evidence and proof. It was the weapon she needed to bring Graham Hull down. "This is enough to ruin him," she whispered. "Why would you betray your own son?" Deacon stayed quiet for a very long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was raw and broken. "Because I am the one who failed him," he confessed. "I taught him to think power was everything. I made him believe that money could get him anything. I taught him that people like us are above the rules. I am the one who created this monster." He paused, swallowing with difficulty. "The very least I can do now is help you stop him." Charlotte examined the old man's face. She was looking for a trick or a hidden motive. She expected a trap. All she saw was deep exhaustion, what seemed like grief, and one more thing. It looked like the final, desperate wish of a dying man who wanted to do one right thing before the end. "There is more," Deacon added. "I am willing to go to court and testify under oath. I will tell them all I know about my son. I will detail every pattern, every victim, and every cover-up I ignored because it was easier." Charlotte felt a change deep inside of her. This was the key. This was what she needed to win. Graham could paint her as a bitter wife out for revenge. He could say she was lying or making things up to get a bigger settlement. But having his own father testify against him, confirming her story and adding more, was entirely different. That was the kind of proof no one could ignore. "Why should I trust that you will not back out?" Charlotte challenged him. "You could suddenly find your family loyalty at the last minute. Your lawyers could claim you were not thinking clearly, or that I tricked you." Deacon offered a weak smile. It was a tired, defeated smile from a man with nothing left to risk. "Because I am dying," he said very simply. "Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. 6 months, maybe not even that. The doctors told me it is too late to operate. Charlotte did not know how to respond, so she just stayed quiet. I will not meet my maker without trying to fix some part of this, Deacon went on. I cannot erase what Graham did. I cannot give those women back the years they lost, the trust they lost, or the parts of themselves he stole. But I can speak the truth. I can finally do that before my time is up. They sat there quietly for a moment. A sad song about lost love played on the jukebox. Their coffee got cold. The afternoon sun began to set. At last, Charlotte spoke. "Thank you," she said. "And for whatever it is worth, I do believe you." Deacon gave a slow nod. "Look after that little girl. Make a better world for her than the one I helped create." Charlotte walked out of the diner with the flash drive safely in her pocket. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from a surge of hope. She felt the powerful feeling that things were finally changing. She understood that Graham Holt's perfect world was about to be completely shattered. That evening, in her mother's guest room, Charlotte finally allowed herself to fall apart. Eleanor was sleeping soundly in the nursery just down the hall. The baby monitor on her nightstand quietly transmitted the sound of soft breaths. The house was completely still. Margot was already asleep. The city noises outside seemed muffled and far away, silenced by the winter air. Then, the emotional weight of it all came crashing down on Charlotte. She sat on the side of the bed she had used when she was a teenager. She looked at the same flower-patterned wallpaper. She saw the same garden view where she had played as a girl. It was where her father pushed her on the swing and where she had imagined her future life. She had dreamed of finding love and happiness with a partner who would adore her, just like her father adored her mother. She had never ever imagined a life like this. The tears finally started to fall. For weeks she had held them in, staying strong and refusing to let Graham see her pain. She cried for the marriage she thought she had. She cried for the man she thought she knew. She cried for the future that was stolen from her, the family she had wanted, and the life she once thought was real. She wept for Eleanor, who would either grow up with no father or with a father who treated her like an object. She wept for the hopeful young woman she used to be, who walked down that aisle 4 years ago. That woman was so sure that love could overcome anything. She cried until she felt completely empty, with no more tears left to shed. Then, she stood up. She went into the bathroom and started to run a bath. The water was hot, almost steaming, and it filled the room with fog. She slid into the tub and let the water rise to her chin, feeling the warmth sink deep into her bones. She did not look at her phone. She did not think of Graham, the lawsuit, the testimony, or the upcoming trial. For a while, she just floated in the quiet, warm nothingness. Her body was still recovering from giving birth. She still had aches and pains, and her body did not feel like her own yet. But she was improving. Every day and every week, she felt herself getting stronger. She sat in the tub until the water turned cold. Then she stood, dried herself, and put on her grandmother's old robe. It was the one Margot kept for all those years, and it still had a faint scent of lavender and rose. She found herself mentally rehearsing what she would say to Graham, a habit she had repeated countless times. She was explaining herself, defending her decisions, and trying to make him understand. She made herself stop. "I do not owe him any explanations," she said aloud. Her words bounced off the tiled walls. "I do not have to explain myself to him. I do not need him to understand me. I only need to survive this. And after I survive, I need to win." Her phone vibrated on the bedside table. She was about to ignore it, but something told her to look. It was a message from Bennett. "Good news. The judge for our case is Ruth Peaton. They call her the Equalizer." Charlotte just stared at the text. She knew that name. Anyone involved with the law knew that name. Ruth Peaton was a true legend. She was a federal judge who had managed some of the biggest cases in the last 20 years. She was known for making powerful men face the consequences of their actions. She could see past expensive lawyers and complicated legal tricks. She delivered justice when others would not. She had put chief executive officers behind bars. She had taken down huge companies that thought they were above the law. She had given a voice to people who had been silenced for years. And now, she was going to be the judge in Charlotte's case. Charlotte smiled. For the first time in a very long time, the smile reached her eyes. It seemed that maybe, just maybe, her luck was finally changing. The trial started on a Tuesday in the middle of January. It was a cold, overcast morning, the kind that makes you want to hide under the covers. But Charlotte had been up since 5 in the morning. She could not sleep, going over her testimony in her mind for what felt like the 100th time. She got to the federal courthouse using a side entrance. Bennett planned it that way so she could skip the media frenzy out front. Dozens of news trucks were parked there. Reporters were shivering in the cold, desperate for any piece of the story. But even the private entrance had cameras. Photographers yelled her name. Microphones were pushed toward her. Voices shouted out questions. Charlotte, what does it feel like to face your husband in a courtroom? Is it true that Graham's own father will testify against him? What message do you have for other women in your position? Charlotte just looked down and kept moving. She let the security team make a path for her. She just had to put one foot in front of the other. That was her only job right now. The courtroom was not as large as she had imagined. The walls were covered in dark wood that seemed old and serious. The bright fluorescent lights overhead made everyone look a little pale. The wooden benches were quickly filling up with reporters, observers, and people who had waited in line for hours to see the show. Graham was already seated. He was at the defendant's table with 3 lawyers in identical dark gray suits beside him. They looked like characters from a movie about law, with their sharp suits, perfect hair, and fancy briefcases. Graham was dressed in a navy suit, a crisp white shirt, and a red tie. It was the uniform of a powerful man, the costume of someone who was certain he would win. He radiated confidence, completely at ease, like this was just another business meeting. Another deal to win, another person to push aside to get exactly what he wanted. His eyes met Charlotte's as she walked to her table, and he smiled. It was the same cold, empty smile that had once tricked her heart into believing in love. But now she finally understood what it really meant. It was the smirk of a predator who had its prey cornered. Bennett gently touched her arm. Do not look at him. Do not show any reaction. Deny him the satisfaction. Charlotte nodded, sat at her table, and organized her papers, keeping her gaze forward. The bailiff announced the judge, and everyone in the room stood up. Ruth Peaton made her entrance into the courtroom. She was 61 years old with short, practical gray hair and a face that revealed nothing. She wore the standard black robes of her position, but on her they seemed different. They were not ceremonial but functional, like the uniform of someone who was profoundly serious about their job. She carried a silent authority that did not need to be announced. It simply filled the room. Charlotte had met powerful men who commanded less respect than this woman. Please be seated, Judge Petten said. Her voice was steady and firm, leaving no room for argument. This court is now in session. Case number 24372, Weston v. Holt. The first day was filled with procedures and opening statements from each side. The complex legal arguments made Charlotte's head spin. Bennett's opening was calm and professional, presenting the facts without any drama. He covered the affair, the planning, the cruelty, and the audio evidence. For 45 minutes, his voice remained steady. Graham's attorney, a man with silver hair named Harrison Pike, used a different tactic. He described Graham as a dedicated husband who made mistakes only because of the immense stress of his job. He implied that Charlotte was overreacting and acting like a victim to get money. Charlotte sat perfectly still as Pike talked. Her face showed no emotion, but a fire of rage burned inside her. Playing the victim? She had a recording of her husband forcing her to her knees. She had messages that proved his cruel plan. She had proof of 40 years of his mistreatment of other women. Let them try to call that an exaggeration. The trial went on for 6 days. 6 days of testimony, evidence, and questioning. For 6 days, Graham's lawyers tried every maneuver they could think of to make Charlotte look unstable and dishonest. Charlotte gave her testimony on the 3rd day. She was in the witness chair for 4 hours. Bennett calmly led her with his questions, helping her tell the story in an orderly way. She spoke of the courtship, the wedding, the seemingly happy early years, the warning signs she had ignored, and then the awful night. Charlotte described everything in detail, every word spoken, and every feeling she had. She spoke in a quiet, matter-of-fact tone, letting the truth stand on its own. She did shed a tear. Her crying was done. She was there to be honest. Then Bennett played the tape, and the courtroom fell completely silent. The reporters stopped taking notes. Even Graham's attorneys stopped their quiet discussions. "Get on your knees." Graham's voice echoed in the room. It was cold, demanding, and cruel. The voice of a man who was used to being obeyed. The voice of a man who had never been refused anything in his life. Charlotte looked at the faces all around her. The crowd, the press, the lawyers, and even Judge Peyton, whose professional composure slipped for a second. She saw shock, horror, and disgust. And for a brief moment, on Graham's face, before he put his mask of confidence back on, she saw something else. She saw fear. He was afraid. He was not afraid of losing his money or his reputation. He was terrified of being exposed for who he truly was. He was scared the world would finally see the monster behind the designer suits and public donations. Good. Let him be scared. Let him feel the same terror she felt that night when he ordered her to apologize for his own betrayal. The tape ended. Charlotte's pained voice apologizing for his lie faded away. Judge Peyton spoke. Her voice was neutral, but a hint of controlled anger lay beneath it. The court will take a 15-minute recess. Charlotte got up from the witness stand. Although her legs were unsteady, she kept her back straight and her head up. She walked right past Graham's table on her way out. He leaned close and whispered a threat only she could hear. "You will regret this. I will destroy you." Charlotte stopped and looked directly at him, maybe for the first time since they were married. This was the man she had loved, the man she had put her faith in, the man who gave her a daughter but had loved neither of them. "No," she replied softly. Her voice was steady and sure. "I do not think I will." She walked out of the courtroom, found a quiet bench by a window, and sat down. She just sat there, breathing, surviving. A woman came and sat beside her. Charlotte did not know her. She was in her late 50s or early 60s, with kind eyes and gray hair in a ponytail. Her coat was simple and practical. She seemed like a completely ordinary person. "You do not know me," the woman said, "and you do not need to, but I had to tell you something." Charlotte turned to face her. "I was married to a man like him for 31 years. The woman's voice was calm but filled with old, deep pain. "I never had your courage. I never stood up to him. I simply survived. Day after day, I just got through it. Then one morning, I realized my entire life was gone." She reached out, took Charlotte's hand, and squeezed it. What you are doing is important," she said. "It is not just for you. It is for all of us. For every woman who was too afraid to fight back, for every woman still feeling trapped, and for all who come after. They will remember that someone stood up and said no." She squeezed Charlotte's hand once more. Then she stood, gave a single nod, and left. Charlotte never saw her again, but she would remember that conversation for the rest of her life. That brief connection with a stranger was a reminder that her struggle was about more than just herself. She took a breath, dried her eyes, and walked back into the court. The work was not finished. The 5th day of the trial was the turning point. The room was so full that every single seat was taken. People were standing along the walls, packed in tightly. Outside, the crowd was so big that the police had to be called. The tension inside the room was so heavy you could feel it. Bennett stood. His voice was quiet but carried through the room. The plaintiff calls Deacon Holt to the stand. A murmur spread through the courtroom. Charlotte heard gasps and saw journalists writing as fast as they could. She fixed her eyes on Graham's face. She saw the color drain away, saw his jaw clench, and saw his knuckles turn white as he gripped the table. All his pretended confidence was gone, replaced by what looked like sheer panic. He had not seen this coming, and neither had his lawyers. Bennett had kept this secret, waiting for the right time to reveal it. Now, Graham watched his own father, the man who built the Holt empire, the man he inherited everything from, make his way to the witness stand. Deacon walked with a cane, tapping the floor with every step. He was thinner and paler than he had been, but his sharp blue eyes were just as alive. After being sworn in, he sat and looked at the courtroom, aware that his words would be heard by millions. Then his gaze fell upon his son. Graham looked back. The father and son were separated by 20 feet and a lifetime of unspoken issues. Graham's expression was a mix of rage, betrayal, and something that could have been grief or hate. Holt, please state your relationship to the defendant. He's my son. Deacon's voice was not as strong as it used to be, but it was still clear. It still held the power of a man who had commanded rooms for decades. I taught him everything I know about business and power. And what did you teach him? Deacon did not answer for a moment. The silence grew. The whole room held its breath. I taught him that power was the only thing that mattered, Deacon said at last. That money could fix any problem, and that kindness was a weakness. He paused. I was wrong about everything. Can you describe your son's behavior towards women? Graham's lawyer jumped up. Objection. Relevance. This is an attack on his character. Bennett spoke calmly. It shows a clear pattern of behavior, Your Honor. The plaintiff claims there was ongoing abuse. This witness has first-hand knowledge of a documented pattern going back many years. Judge Petton paused to think. She glanced from Bennett to Deacon and then to Graham. A flicker of something crossed her face. It looked almost like she was pleased. I will permit it. The witness can answer the question. Deacon drew a deep breath. When he finally spoke, his voice was filled with sorrow. It was the sound of a man confessing sins he had hidden for his entire life. My son sees women as property. They are things to acquire, to be used, and then thrown away when he is done with them. He paused. I have records for at least 14 women he has mistreated over the last 20 years. There were settlements, confidentiality agreements, and people who suddenly quit their jobs. It was a pattern that anyone could see if they just opened their eyes. And you chose not to open your eyes? I chose to ignore it. Deacon's voice trembled. It was just simpler that way, and it was better for our business. I convinced myself it was none of my business. I thought Graham's private life was his own. He let out a bitter laugh. Private life? That is certainly one way to put it. And what about Charlotte Weston? Was she also something to be acquired? Yes, I believe she was. For the first time, Deacon looked directly at Charlotte. His eyes were filled with tears. The Weston family name had a certain respect that even the Holt fortune could not purchase. Her father is a well-respected judge. Her mother's family is one of the oldest in New York. Graham saw a chance. His voice grew cold. And he took that chance the way he takes everything, with no thought for the people he injures. He has no empathy, no conscience. Do you think your son was ever in love with Ms. Weston? Graham's lawyer stood up to object again. The judge agreed with him this time, but it was already too late. The question lingered in the silent courtroom, unanswered but clearly understood. Holt, why have you come to testify today? Why would you testify against your own son in a public court? Deacon remained silent for a long time. He looked at Charlotte and then at the baby carrier next to her. Eleanor was sleeping inside, not knowing the history being decided around her. Then he looked at his son, his only child, Tal, the person who would inherit everything he had built. Because I had a hand in creating him, Deacon said at last. I raised him to have no empathy, no conscience, and no idea that other people are important. He never learned that the rules apply to everyone, or that some things cannot be bought with money. His voice began to break. I created this monster, and now I must do my part to stop him. He turned to face Graham directly. Father to son, sharing a look of pain and love that had turned to hate. I let you down, Graham. I did not raise you correctly. I taught you that people were objects, that being cruel was a sign of strength, and that men like us were above the rules. Deacon's voice was now just a faint whisper, but his words reached every single corner of the quiet courtroom. I am sorry. I am so sorry for what I turned you into. I am sorry for every woman you have harmed, because I taught you that women were not important. But being sorry is not enough. The only thing left for me to do is to speak the truth and pray that somehow it will prevent you from hurting anyone else. The courtroom was completely still. You could not hear a cough, a whisper, or any sound at all. Then Graham shot to his feet. His face was distorted with fury. His voice was a low growl. This is insane. He is not even my father anymore. He is a sick old man who has been manipulated by Ms. Holt. Judge Petton's voice was like ice. You will take your seat and be quiet, or I will have you escorted from my courtroom. Do you understand me? Graham just stood there for a second, shaking with anger. Then his lawyers tugged him back into his chair, whispering urgently to him. He sat down, but he never took his eyes off his father. Deacon looked back at him with an expression that could have been sorrow or pity, or perhaps a final goodbye. Sienna Cross was called to the witness stand that afternoon. She was not the same woman Charlotte remembered from that evening in the penthouse. She looked smaller and much more breakable. The powerful confidence she once had was completely gone. Now, she seemed to be filled with something that resembled fear. She wore a plain gray dress with no fancy labels or costly jewelry. She appeared to be a person trying her best not to be noticed. Bennett's questions were kind but firm. "Cross, how long did your affair with Graham Holt last?" "2 years. Sienna's voice was so quiet it was hard to hear. "It began about 6 months before he got married. Did he make a promise to you that he would leave his wife?" Sienna paused, glanced at Graham, and then quickly looked away, as if she could not stand to look at him. "He told me he just needed to have a child first. He said that after the baby arrived, he would divorce Charlotte and we would get married. Were you there on the night that Graham made Charlotte kneel?" The silence in the room grew longer. Sienna's hands were trembling. "Yes. Can you please tell us what took place?" "He forced her to get on her knees and say she was sorry to me." Sienna's voice broke. "It happened in the main hall of their apartment. She was 8 months pregnant. It was very difficult for her to get down on the floor, but he insisted that she do it." "And what was your reaction?" The question hung in the room. Sienna's face crumpled in shame. "I laughed," she whispered. The word landed in the courtroom like a heavy rock thrown into a quiet pond. The disgust spread through the room. "I laughed," Sienna said again, this time louder, as if she were admitting to a terrible crime. "I believed I was the winner. I believed it was proof that he loved me more than he loved her. I believed I was superior to her. And do you still think that is true?" Sienna shook her head no. Tears ran down her cheeks, smearing her makeup and washing away the false image she had maintained for so long. "He was never in love with me," she said. "He has never been in love with anyone. I was just another thing that was useful to him. A tool, a weapon he could use against his wife. Charlotte was useful in the same way. Everyone is useful to Graham until they are not useful anymore." She then looked at Charlotte. She really saw her, maybe for the very first time. "I realize that does not change anything. I realize it does not make things right. But I am sorry for everything." Charlotte felt a change happening inside of her. She had detested Sienna for such a long time. She had played out the scene of confronting her over and over, yelling at her, wanting her to feel the same hurt that Charlotte had felt. But as she sat there, watching Sienna fall apart on the witness stand, Charlotte experienced a feeling she did not expect. Sienna had also been a victim of his manipulation. It was not in the same way, and not as severe, but she was manipulated all the same. She was used and then thrown away, just like everyone else in Graham's world. Graham had done this to them both. He had made them enemies. He made them compete for small bits of his attention, while he secretly mocked them. He made them despise each other, so they wouldn't see that he was the real one to blame. Charlotte did not offer Sienna her forgiveness. She was not certain if she ever would be able to. But she let go of her hatred, because hate is a heavy burden, and Charlotte was done carrying a weight that was not hers to bear. She made eye contact with Sienna across the courtroom and gave a single nod. It was just a simple recognition, from one person to another, from one survivor to another. Then she turned her gaze away. The prosecution finished its case late that afternoon. The next day, the judge would announce her decision. The next day, it would all be over. The courtroom was filled far beyond its normal limits. People stood in the corridors, viewing the proceedings on television screens that had been quickly installed for the extra crowd. For blocks in every direction outside the courthouse, news vans were parked. Groups of protesters had formed on both sides of the issue. Their signs and their shouting created a steady hum of noise that could be heard even inside the thick stone building. Inside the courtroom, Charlotte sat at the table for the plaintiff. Her hands were calmly folded in her lap. Her expression was serene and composed, revealing none of her feelings. But inside, her heart was beating so rapidly she could almost feel it in her throat. This was the moment. After so many months of struggle, after all the pain she had gone through, The kneeling, the shame, the frozen bank accounts, the public attacks on her character, the testimony, and all the evidence, everything had come down to this single point in time. Eleanor was in a safe room in another part of the courthouse with Margot, and Marcus, the security guard, was watching over them. Charlotte needed her daughter with her that day, even though Eleanor was too little to know what was going on. Just having her nearby gave Charlotte strength. The doors opened, and Judge Ruth Peaton entered. Everyone in the courtroom stood up. The judge looked as she always did, calm and unreadable, in complete control. She neatly arranged her papers, then looked over the packed courtroom. She allowed the quiet to stretch until it was almost too much to bear. Then she broke the silence. This court has heard many hours of testimony over the past 6 days. We have gone over recordings, documents, and the words of many witnesses. We have weighed the arguments from the plaintiff and the defense. We have heard testimony from members of the family, from past partners, and from expert witnesses. She stopped for a moment. The silence was total. The details of this case are highly unusual. They are also, sadly, not uncommon. Ruth Peaton turned to look at Graham. Her eyes were steady and assessing, showing no emotion. The defendant, Graham Holt, was involved in an affair with Sienna Cross for roughly 2 years, which started before his marriage to Charlotte Weston. He hid this affair by using a systematic pattern of lies. He married Ms. Weston with the clear and documented intention, found in his own text messages, of having a child with her and then getting rid of her. She allowed the weight of her words to be felt. Most importantly, on the evening of November 14th, Graham Holt made his wife, who was 8 months pregnant, get on her knees on a marble floor in front of his mistress and apologize for discovering his unfaithfulness. What he did was not a heated mistake, but a cold, deliberate plan to humiliate and control her, to crush her spirit into obedience. The judge then looked at Charlotte. Weston displayed incredible bravery by recording his abuse and exposing it. The tape she made is one of the most upsetting pieces of evidence ever presented in this court. She turned her gaze back to Graham. This court has seen a clear history of emotional abuse, forceful control, and planned cruelty spanning many years. Holt did more than just cheat on his wife. He purposefully destroyed her self-worth. He even used her own body and her pregnancy as a method of control. He coldly planned to get rid of her after she gave him a child. Graham's legal team wrote frantically. Graham sat frozen, his face a tight mask of rage. Judge Peaton then said, "This court hereby orders the following." She spoke from her notes, every word a nail in Graham Holt's coffin. Full legal custody of Eleanor Charlotte Weston is granted to her mother. The defendant is allowed supervised visits only, pending written consent from the plaintiff and a full psychological review. Charlotte breathed out. It was the first win. 70% of all marital assets are awarded to the plaintiff. This ruling covers the Manhattan penthouse, all properties bought during the marriage, her entire prenuptial agreement, and a large share of the cash in their joint bank accounts. Graham's attorney began to stand up. Judge Peaton's sharp glance made him sit back down. The defendant must also make a public apology. This apology must be broadcast on television during prime viewing hours on a date the court will decide. During this broadcast, the defendant must admit his abuse, claim full responsibility, and personally apologize to his wife for what happened on November 14th. A low buzz went through the room. A public apology on primetime television. Graham Holt would be forced to confess his wrongdoing before the entire nation. But Judge Peaton had more to say. There is one final issue. Her voice lowered, becoming more personal. It is a matter this court has considered very carefully. The entire room became completely still. "Holt, you will stand." Graham got up slowly. His attorneys whispered to him, but he ignored them. He stood before the judge, with his shoulders back, trying to appear confident. But Charlotte knew he had none left. Judge Peaton spoke. "In this very room, we listened to testimony about a uniquely cruel act. On the evening of November 14th, you made your pregnant wife kneel on a marble floor to apologize for finding out you cheated. You did this while your mistress stood by and laughed." She paused, letting the statement sink in. This court cannot reverse that action. It cannot take away the humiliation, the suffering, or the deep emotional scars. It cannot restore the parts of Miss Weston that you broke that night. She paused again. But it can create balance. It can make certain that you truly and publicly comprehend what you did to another person. Graham's expression began to change. His composure was breaking. A hint of pure panic started showing. "Holt," Judge Petton declared, her voice echoing in the chamber. "You will kneel." The courtroom exploded. Graham's lawyers were on their feet, yelling objections and arguing about legal history and unfair punishment. Judge Petton simply waited. She allowed the noise to surround her. She let the lawyers wear themselves out. Then she lifted a single hand. A sudden silence fell over the room. "This is not a punishment," she said with calm authority. "It is a lesson in perspective. You will kneel here and apologize, not to your wife, but to every woman who has ever been belittled by a man who thought his wealth made him invincible. Apologize to every person who was ever silenced, to every survivor who was told no one would believe her." Graham was motionless. His face had lost all its color. His entire body shook. "Kneel, Mr. Holt, or you will face contempt of court and 60 days in the county jail." The quiet lingered. 1 second, then 2, then 5, then 10. Charlotte watched. Everyone in the room watched. Millions watching the live broadcast held their breath. Graham Holt, the billionaire industrialist, the man who made his pregnant wife get on her knees, finally started to bend his own. It was not a smooth or graceful act. It was the awkward motion of a man who had never submitted to anyone before in his life. He went lower and lower until his knees met the hard floor. He was kneeling in the middle of the courtroom, before the cameras, the reporters, and the 12 million people watching from around the globe. "Now you will apologize," Judge Petton demanded. Graham's voice was a rough, broken whisper. "I apologize." "Louder," she commanded. "Let them all hear it." "I apologize." His face was a mask of shame, anger, and the jarring realization that his power was useless here. All his money and influence could not spare him from this moment. Charlotte just watched. She had replayed this scene in her mind countless times since that awful November night. She had imagined the deep satisfaction she would feel, the sweet victory in seeing him brought so low. But as she watched Graham kneel on the floor, she felt something else entirely. It was not satisfaction or victory or even justice. It was done. The nightmare was finally, truly, and completely done. He could never harm her again. He could no longer control her. He could never again make her feel insignificant or worthless. She was finally free. Ruth Petton gave a small nod. "You can get up now, Mr." Graham rose to his feet. His legs trembled noticeably. He refused to look at anyone. For the very first time, he looked exactly like what he was, a small, defeated man. "This court is now adjourned," the judge announced. "Miss Weston, I wish you and your daughter all the best. You have displayed amazing courage during this process. May your future be filled with light." Charlotte stood up. "Thank you, Your Honor." She exited the courtroom, walking right past Graham, who still would not meet her gaze, and past all the cameras and reporters. Harper was there waiting for her. Margot was also there holding Eleanor. The baby was awake, her wide blue eyes observing the chaos with innocent wonder. Charlotte took her daughter into her arms, holding her tight and breathing in her sweet baby scent. "It is all over, my sweet girl," she whispered. "We finally did it." Eleanor made a soft sound. Her tiny hand reached out and gently touched her mother's face. Her smile was bright and pure, full of a future that was now clear and open. Charlotte smiled back, the first true and unguarded smile she had shown in a very long time. She had fought a hard battle. She had endured. She had survived. And now she could finally start her life. 3 months later, Charlotte was sitting on the terrace of the Manhattan penthouse, which was now all hers. The city lights sparkled in the dark, a million untold stories in the windows below. Eleanor was asleep in her room. The baby monitor on the table quietly broadcasted the soft, steady sound of her breathing. The verdict had changed absolutely everything. Graham's apology was aired 3 weeks after the trial. It was 32 minutes of prime-time television on every big network. It showed Graham at a desk reading a prepared script, his face pale and tired, his voice flat. 93 million people saw it live. Millions more watched the clips later. The internet memes were brutal. Pictures of Graham kneeling in court. Videos of him reading his apology like a hostage. He had become a joke, a symbol of a powerful man finally getting what he deserved. His own board of directors fired him as the chief executive officer just 2 weeks after the verdict. The company his father had built wanted nothing to do with him. He was now a disgrace and a bad investment. His story became a warning that business schools would use for years. Sienna left for Europe the day after the trial ended. Charlotte heard she went to Paris, then Milan, and then somewhere in Switzerland. She never sent a message or tried to make contact. Charlotte had no idea where Sienna was, and she did not really care. That part of her life was over. 14 other women had spoken out after the trial. They were 14 women Graham had harmed over the years. They were 14 women who had signed non-disclosure agreements and accepted money to stay quiet out of fear that no one would listen. But now they were finally talking. And now they were finally being heard. Graham was now facing a mountain of lawsuits that would occupy his lawyers for a long time. The financial settlements from those cases alone would probably take everything he had left. Charlotte did not enjoy his suffering, but she did not feel bad for him either. He made his own bed, and now he had to lie in it. Deacon had passed away 6 weeks after he testified. He died in his sleep at a care facility in Connecticut. Charlotte sent flowers for the funeral service, but did not go herself. She had already made her peace with him at the diner, the day he handed her the flash drive and gave her his promise. She had kept his last request. His foundation for abuse victims was doing very well, and Charlotte was a board member. She helped create programs for women leaving men like Graham, offering everything they needed to start over. But it did not feel like enough. It could never erase the harm he had caused. Still, it was a beginning, a small seed of hope. An article about her story won a major award. It was titled The Acquisition: How Billionaire Graham Holt Weaponized Marriage. The piece shared her experience, and that of 14 other women. It exposed a system that let men like Graham thrive. Charlotte read it just one time. After that, she put it away for good. The past was over, and she was looking ahead. Harper came to visit each week. They would relax on the terrace with wine or tea. They talked about simple things like books and television shows. They even laughed about a difficult library customer. It was the simple, normal stuff of life, and it felt amazing. Her mother stayed in the penthouse for a time after the trial. She wanted to help with Eleanor and see that Charlotte was all right. But Margot went back to her own home last month. Standing in the doorway with her bag, she said, "You are going to be fine without me. You have a strength you never realized. And Eleanor is so fortunate to have you." Charlotte gave her a long, tight hug. For a second, she felt like a little girl again, completely safe. "Thank you," she whispered, "for always being there for me, for trusting me, and for having that lawyer's card ready, just in case." Margot smiled, kissed her forehead, and left into the bright sunshine. Charlotte sat on the terrace by herself, reflecting on it all. She remembered the naive woman she used to be, who thought love could fix anything. She was different now, tougher and smarter, and knew love alone was not enough. A person also needed to be strong and brave enough to stand up for themselves. She found her hand going to her phone, locking and unlocking it. It was an old, anxious habit from her years with Graham. She used to check it constantly, waiting for his validation. She stopped, smiled, and put the phone down. She no longer required his acceptance. She did not need it from anyone. She understood her own value now. The following day, Margot visited for coffee. They sat and talked while Eleanor played on a blanket, chewing on a toy. The baby was nearly 11 months old. She had her mom's eyes and her grandma's determined chin. She was a beautiful baby. "You have changed," Margot said simply. It was a statement, not a question. Charlotte thought for a moment. "I have. How does it feel?" She watched Eleanor grab for a toy. "I once believed strength was about never falling apart," she said. "It was about smiling when you are hurting and acting like things were okay. But I realize now that is not strength. That is just getting by. True strength is something else." Charlotte looked at her mother. She was a woman who had raised her alone, faced her own hardships, and rebuilt her own life from nothing. "Real strength is allowing yourself to break," Charlotte explained. "It is feeling all the pain. Then you gather the pieces and create something different. she added with a smile, "and you accept that you will never be the same person you were before." Margot's eyes filled with tears as she squeezed Charlotte's hand. "Your grandmother would have been so proud." "I know," Charlotte replied. "I am finally proud of me too." A year after that, Charlotte was on a stage in a large hotel room. 500 people stared up at her from their seats. The audience was full of survivors, supporters, and reporters. They came from all across the country for the conference. They were people who understood her fight, because they had their own. Charlotte was asked to be the main speaker, but at first she declined. She was still scared of speaking in public. Telling her story felt like reopening an old injury. But she recalled the stranger in the courthouse. The woman said her fight was important and wished she had been as brave. If her story could help just one person, it was worth facing her fear. "He made me kneel when I was 8 months pregnant." The room went silent. Every person held their breath. "My husband made me get on my knees and say I was sorry to his other woman. He wanted to show me that he had all the power. He wanted me to feel like I was his property." Charlotte paused for a moment. She allowed the memory to return one final time. She let herself feel the pain again. "I stayed on the floor because I did not know I had a choice. I had no idea I could resist. I never realized my voice had power. I did not understand the power of the truth." She saw tears, anger, and hope in the audience. She could see they understood. "Now I know that standing up is always a choice. You can do it even if you are afraid. You can do it when people tell you to be quiet and accept things." Her voice grew stronger. "You are allowed to cause a disruption. You are allowed to be loud and take up room. You deserve respect and love that does not cause you pain." She thought of Eleanor, her 2-year-old daughter. Her little girl would grow up in a very different world. She would grow up seeing that women can resist. She would know that truth is important and justice can happen. "We stand up," Charlotte declared, "not because it is simple. We do it because it is the only path ahead. We do it for our daughters and for the women before us who could not. We rise up because we are worth more. We are better than that." She paused and smiled. "So, stand up. Use your voice. And when someone tries to silence you or make you feel small, please remember this. You are not by yourself. You are never by yourself. And you are stronger than you can imagine." A few people began to clap, then more joined in. Soon, the sound was like thunder, a powerful wave that she could feel. She moved away from the stand. Her heart was beating fast and her eyes were teary, but she was smiling. She had finally done it. She had shared her story. She had finally used her voice. She was sure someone in the audience needed to hear her words. Someone who was in the same place she had been 3 years ago. That evening, Charlotte returned home. She paid the sitter and went to check on Eleanor. Her daughter was sleeping soundly, surrounded by her toys. She sat on the bed and watched her daughter's chest rise and fall as she slept. Her little hand held her favorite toy elephant. "You will never get on your knees for anybody," she whispered. "Do you understand me, Eleanor Charlotte Weston? Not for anyone, for any reason, ever." Eleanor moved a little in her sleep and smiled, almost as if she heard her. Charlotte kissed her daughter's forehead. Then she walked over to the window. The lights of Manhattan sparkled below. This was the city where her life had collapsed. It was also the city where she put it all back together. She thought for a moment about Graham. People said he was now living in a smaller house out in the Hamptons. He was staying out of sight and dealing with many lawsuits. She realized she did not hate him. She did not love him either. She felt completely nothing toward him. His part of her life was over, like a finished chapter in a book. He was in her past, but not in her future. She still had the recording he made on her phone. She would sometimes listen late at night, not to feel the pain again, but to remember how much she had changed and how far she had come. From a woman who was forced to her knees to a woman who now stands with her head held high. From a wife who was made to feel sorry for her own existence to a mother who insisted on something better. From being silent to finding her voice. From living in fear to embracing her freedom. From being shattered to being made whole again. Charlotte moved away from the window, went to her bedroom, put on her pajamas, brushed her teeth, and washed her face. She got into her bed, pulling the blanket up to her chin, and then she closed her eyes. The sounds of the city were a low hum outside her window. The baby monitor made soft crackling sounds with Eleanor's breaths. The apartment was still and calm, filled with the sounds of a brand new life. The next day would have its own set of problems, its own successes, its own chances to become stronger. Her story was not finished. It was only just starting. But for that night, Charlotte Weston slept a deep and peaceful sleep without any dreams. The nightmares were finally gone, and the rest of her beautiful life was ahead of her. And that is the story of Charlotte Weston, a woman who decided she would no longer kneel. If her story made you feel something, if it made you angry, if it gave you hope, then I want you to do one thing for me. Please click that like button. It makes a bigger difference than you can imagine. Leave me a comment down below. Let me know which part of the story touched you the most. Share this with anyone who needs a reminder that they can always stand up for themselves. And if you are not subscribed, please join our family. We tell stories that truly matter. Until we meet again, be strong and never bow down.